January 19th, 2015, somewhere deep inside a cave system in the mountains of northeastern Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant David Chen stands frozen, a sphere of weapons-grade plutonium in his pack, staring at something his brain refuses to accept as real. It crouches in the darkness just 20 feet away, a mass of matted fur and impossibly long limbs bent at angles that make his eyes hurt. Claws the length of kitchen knives click softly against the stone floor. And where there should be a face, there is nothing, just an empty void in the vague shape of a skull, filled with row after row of glistening teeth. It doesn't breathe, it doesn't blink, it simply waits. Behind Dave, 4 of his teammates have their rifles raised, fingers on triggers, none of them daring to move. In the next 30 seconds, 3 of them will be dead. The 4th will sacrifice himself to give Dave a chance to escape, and whatever is standing in this cave will add their bodies to the dozens of mangled corpses already scattered across this mountainside. To understand how a squad of elite special operators ended up face-to-face with something that Afghan tribes have feared for thousands of years, we need to go back 72 hours to a briefing that would change everything. Welcome to Signal 7, and today we're covering Operation Condor, a mission to recover stolen nuclear material that uncovered something far worse than any terrorist threat, something that the people of these mountains have feared since before written history. If these stories interest you, like and subscribe for more. By January of 2015, Dave had been rotating in and out of Afghanistan for going on 3 years. Despite what the politicians back in Washington said about troop withdrawals and winding down operations, there was more activity in that part of the world than most people would ever know. The difference was that it had gone underground, less open warfare, more clandestine work. His commanding officer liked to call it secret squirrel shit. Dave's unit fell under the umbrella of the United States Joint Special Operations Command, a catch-all structure for certain special forces elements across every branch of the military: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, even a few Coast Guard operators floating around somewhere in the mix. These weren't the kind of soldiers who walked around villages on patrol or swept roads for improvised explosives. That wasn't in their job description. One of Dave's instructors had put it simply during training: they did bad things to bad people. You didn't get into special operations because you wanted to win hearts and minds. Most of their missions were straightforward, at least as straightforward as clandestine work could be. Raids on high-value targets, capture or kill operations, and endless hours of intelligence gathering. Dave had lost count of how many nights he'd spent lying on some frozen mountainside, staring through a spotting scope, watching potential insurgents go about their daily routines. It was tedious, unglamorous work, and by that January, he was thoroughly bored of it. That changed when a CIA ground branch agent appeared at their forward operating base seemingly out of nowhere, claiming he had the most critical mission of the past 50 years, more important, he said, than even the Bin Laden raid. Not many of the operators believed him at first, but as the agent spread reconnaissance photos across the table, played back phone intercepts, and walked them through months of surveillance footage, the pieces fell into place. By the time he finished, every man in that room understood exactly what was at stake. The CIA had been tracking a terrorist cell operating out of Afghanistan, a group known only as the Brotherhood. Their goal was something that Al-Qaeda had been attempting for decades: obtaining nuclear material, either for a dirty bomb or something worse. It didn't matter. The difference was that the Brotherhood had actually succeeded. According to the intelligence, they had made contact with a former Soviet general who still had access to weapons-grade plutonium. The deal had gone down in Tajikistan, and now the cell was making its way back into Afghanistan with enough nuclear material to devastate a city. CIA assets had tracked them as far as the Afghan border before they disappeared into the mountains without a trace, and that was where Dave's unit came in. The mission was designated Operation Condor. On paper, it wasn't complicated: find the terrorists, eliminate them, and secure the plutonium before it could be used. But simple didn't mean easy. The target area was brutal mountain terrain, with almost zero friendly forces anywhere nearby, and a significant enemy presence throughout the region. The team spent hours bouncing ideas back and forth before settling on a plan. One squad of 10 men would be inserted by helicopter near the last known location of the target. They would hike in on foot, engage the enemy, secure the nuclear material, and extract. It was tempting to send more bodies for the extra firepower, but more men meant a larger signature. Sneaking 10 operators into position was hard enough. 40 would be impossible. Dave volunteered without hesitation. It wasn't about glory or hunting for an adrenaline rush. He was simply tired of doing nothing but reconnaissance work for weeks on end, and his additional training for dealing with chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats made him a natural fit for the team. Once the squad was assembled, they spent most of the night hammering out contingencies, trying to anticipate everything that could go wrong. But every operator in that room knew there were certain things you just couldn't plan for. Everyone has a strategy until they get punched in the mouth. The moon hung full and bright in the sky the following night as the team gathered their equipment and boarded the helicopters. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold was still brutal, cutting through every layer of clothing like it wasn't even there. Dave tried to bundle up in the back of the Chinook as the aircraft rumbled to life, the scream of the rotors drowning out the podcast playing through his headset. Some of the operators sat in silence, others talked over the onboard communication system, but Dave just tried to sleep. You never knew when those extra minutes of rest would make the difference later. Joey, their team leader, woke him when they were 10 minutes out from the landing zone. Dave checked his equipment one final time and pulled his night vision goggles down over his eyes, flicking them on and blinking as his vision flooded with pale green light. The helicopter shuddered beneath them as the pilot dipped below the mountain peaks, winds buffeting the airframe like a tin can in a hurricane. But the pilot held steady, and moments later they touched down in a flurry of rotor wash, snow and ice swirling around them as they rushed out into the night. As soon as the last man cleared the ramp, the Chinook lifted off, blasting the squad with one final torrent of freezing wind before disappearing into the darkness. The sound of the rotors faded to a distant rumble, then to nothing at all, leaving them in near total silence. Only the low moan of wind through the mountain pass remained. The snow was ankle-deep, a fine powder that seemed to evaporate the moment the wind caught it. They started moving immediately, making their way up the side of the mountain with nothing but their night vision to guide them. The terrain was treacherous even in the green-tinted glow of the goggles, loose rocks hidden beneath the snow, steep drops appearing without warning. Progress was painfully slow. It was just after 3 in the morning when they reached the first checkpoint, a rocky outcropping jutting from the mountainside. Carlos, their radio operator, stopped to relay their position back to command, while the rest of the squad took a knee and tried to catch their breath. Dave had grown up in the mountains of Colorado and was no stranger to hiking at altitude, but this was something else entirely. The thin air burned in his lungs with every breath. After a few moments, Carlos gave them a thumbs up and relayed the response from command. No new intelligence. Stay on mission. The sky to the east was just beginning to lighten when they reached the next checkpoint several hours later. Almost 3 hours of hiking, and they had covered less than 2 miles. Everyone was exhausted and sore, but they pushed their discomfort aside and focused on the task at hand. As they descended into a long draw leading toward the target's last known location, the terrain began to change around them. Bare rock and snow gave way to thin forests of pine and scrub brush, offering some concealment from any hostile eyes that might be watching. But if anything, the squad grew more tense as daylight approached. Dawn was when the insurgents came out to play. Joey gathered them together an hour later, everyone speaking in hushed voices as they discussed the next move. They had 2 options: keep pushing now and risk being caught in the open during daylight, or wait until dark. Night would give them concealment, but trying to navigate this terrain in darkness would be nearly suicidal, even with night vision. The goggles made it possible to see, but they destroyed any sense of depth perception. One wrong step could send someone tumbling off the mountainside. The squad reached a consensus: push on and try to complete the mission, even if it meant operating in daylight. Joey nodded and told Dave to take point. The landscape glowed with golden light as the sun finally crested the horizon. They moved through the forest using the long shadows for cover, scanning the slopes on either side for anything out of place. Easier said than done. Insurgent groups in these mountains were experts at concealment, their positions invisible until it was too late. And the going was getting rougher by the minute. Loose shale crumbled underfoot with every step. It didn't take long for Dave's luck to run out. His boot landed on what looked like solid ground, but the rocks immediately shifted and slid out from under him. He reached for a tree branch, but his hand closed on empty air. One foot slipped, then the other, and suddenly he was skidding down the slope, tumbling once and landing hard on his pack. The impact drove the breath from his lungs as he scrambled for something to stop his fall. His arms found a thin pine sapling, and he wrapped himself around it, digging his heels into the loose rock as the tree bent and groaned, but held. He lay there for a moment, gasping, then slowly pulled himself up to check for damage. Aside from some scrapes, everything seemed intact. Joey appeared at his side a moment later, reaching down to help him up. But as Dave sat up to take his hand, Joey froze. His eyes went wide, his mouth hanging open, staring at something over Dave's shoulder. Dave turned and his heart nearly stopped. Lying beneath a small rock outcropping not 5 feet from where he had come to rest was a body. The man was dressed in traditional Afghan clothing and very obviously dead. Blood spatter coated the rocks around him. The left side of his skull had been caved in, one eyeball hanging loose against his cheek. His jaw was twisted and broken at an unnatural angle, and 3 of his ribs had punched through the fabric of his jacket, the beige material soaked dark with blood. Dave realized he had raised his rifle and had it trained on the corpse. He lowered it slowly, letting out a shaky breath. Andy, their medic, moved up to examine the body, turning it over carefully. There was an AK-47 pinned underneath, and when Andy pulled out the magazine, it was empty. He observed that the man didn't appear to have been shot. The injuries looked more like the result of a catastrophic fall, hitting rocks and trees on the way down. Thomas, one of their machine gunners, suggested that was probably what happened, that the guy had slipped just like Dave and broken himself apart on the mountainside. Andy seemed to agree, at least partially, but Dave found himself staring at something else, a wound on the side of the man's neck, a ragged hole almost the size of a baseball that went all the way down to the spine. Andy suggested it might have been a predator that found the body after the fall, a coyote or mountain cat looking for an easy meal. Dave kept his mouth shut, but something didn't add up. Predators didn't take a single bite and walk away. If an animal had found this corpse, it would have been torn apart completely. There wouldn't be anything left. Joey told the squad to stay focused, reminding them they still had a mission to complete, and ordered them to move out. Dave pushed the questions to the back of his mind and got himself back in the game. But some small part of his brain refused to stay quiet, even as they continued up the mountain. The terrain leveled out slightly as they moved onto a ridge running around the side of the mountain, though the going was still rough. They used trees to pull themselves along and steady their pace, stopping more than once as the altitude and the punishing march took their toll. It was almost 9 in the morning when Joey called for another rest. Dave found a spot between 2 bushes and took a long drink from his canteen. That was when the gunfire started. The shots were distant, muffled pops and cracks echoing through the valley, but every operator reached for their weapon and dropped into a defensive perimeter, scanning the forest around them. No one spoke as the firing continued. A constant roar at first, then tapering off to scattered shots, then silence. For another minute they lay there, waiting for more, wondering if the next rounds would come screaming over their heads. None did. Carlos keyed his radio and contacted the Tactical Operations Center, asking if there were any air assets in the area that could take a look at whatever was happening out there. The response came back negative. All aircraft were tied up elsewhere. When command asked if the squad was in contact, Joey replied that they weren't, that the gunfire had come from about a kilometer away and wasn't directed at them. Command acknowledged and signed off. Carlos muttered under his breath about the Air Force not being able to spare a single drone to help them see what they were walking into. Joey offered him a rare grin, clapped him on the shoulder, and told the squad to get moving. Eyes up. The next hour passed, much like the previous ones, quiet and still, broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the chattering of birds in the trees. They didn't hear any more shots, but everyone kept their weapons ready, stopping every few minutes to listen for signs of danger. The ridge eventually turned into a long valley that sloped upward toward the mountain summit, ending a few hundred feet below the peak. Dave tried not to groan at the thought of climbing that monster of a hill, but that thought vanished when Joey suddenly raised his fist, signaling a halt, and dropped to one knee. He pointed toward the top of the valley, and Dave pulled out a small set of binoculars to see what had caught his attention. There, clear as day, was the entrance to a cave. It was small from this distance, little more than a dark speck against the gray rock and white snow. But that wasn't what made Dave's pulse quicken. Nestled between 2 large boulders near the entrance sat a sandbagged machine gun position, the barrel of the weapon pointing uselessly at the sky. Dave scanned the surrounding area for any sign of fighters manning the position or hiding nearby. There was nothing, no movement at all. Joey took the binoculars and looked for himself. After a long moment, he lowered them and said that something wasn't right. Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters didn't leave machine gun nests unmanned and exposed like that. On any normal day, the squad would have been taking fire the moment they came within range. Dave agreed. Insurgents in these mountains were masters of concealment. They used scouts and overlapping fields of fire. Finding a heavy weapon completely abandoned was far outside the norm. Joey considered their options, then announced they would at least go check it out. If nothing was there, they could mark the position for an airstrike later and make sure it couldn't be used again. They began the painful task of climbing the steep valley toward the cave entrance. The altitude punished their lungs with every breath, and at some points they were nearly crawling on hands and knees. Progress was agonizingly slow, all of them hoping to reach the top before they collapsed from exhaustion. Joey raised his hand again, bringing the squad to a halt, and pointed toward a stand of trees about 50 yards ahead. Something was sticking out from between the trunks, a tuft of fabric, with something dark and wet coating the ground beneath it. Dave swallowed, raised his rifle, and began advancing alongside Joey. A few moments later, the squad was kneeling in a semicircle around the second body, staring with grim fascination at what remained of the man. This one was far worse than the first. One arm had been torn away at the shoulder, and the abdomen had been ripped open as if by an angry machine, meat and bone exposed to the cold mountain air. Blood painted the rocks in wide streaks. Dave tried to block out the expression of absolute terror frozen on the dead man's face as he reached down to pick up the rifle lying nearby. The barrel had been bent almost 90 degrees, twisted like it had been caught in a vise. He checked the magazine. Empty. Thomas voiced what everyone was thinking, that something wasn't right here, that this was getting weird. No one argued with him. And for the first time since Dave had known him, he saw something unfamiliar in Joey's eyes. Not fear, not hesitation, confusion, like he was trying to fit puzzle pieces together and nothing was matching up. Joey took a few slow breaths, stepped back from the corpse, and told them to keep moving. They found more bodies the higher they climbed. Some were scattered among the trees, others wedged between rocks. Many looked like they had been in car accidents, their limbs twisted and broken at unnatural angles. Others had been torn apart, long gashes carved through their flesh, entire limbs missing. They found one man impaled on a tree branch, nearly 20 feet off the ground. His blood was still dripping as they passed beneath him. The ground became littered with spent shell casings, hundreds of them crunching underfoot near empty rifles and abandoned machine guns. Some of the weapons had been almost completely destroyed, barrels bent into curves, receivers crushed flat. Whatever had happened here, these men had fought back. They had emptied magazine after magazine into something, and it hadn't made any difference. Dave had faced death plenty of times in his career. He had watched friends bleed out in his arms, seen men vaporized by roadside bombs, watched the life drain from enemies he had shot. He had felt fear before, the sharp spike of adrenaline when bullets snapped past his head or a mortar landed too close. But this was different. This was something deeper, something primal. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn around and run and never look back. This was a place of death, and he didn't belong here. But he forced those thoughts aside. The rest of the team was counting on him, just as he was counting on them. They finally reached the machine gun nest at the top of the valley. Dave found the gunner, what was left of him, sprawled in the snow behind the sandbags. The man had been nearly torn in half. Dave suppressed the urge to gag and spun around when someone called out. Andy was gesturing urgently from behind an improvised shelter nearby. Nothing more than sheets of corrugated metal propped against a boulder. The squad rushed over to find him kneeling next to a man who was still alive, barely, whimpering and crying as he tried to hold his intestines inside his body with blood-soaked hands. Joey waved Aaron forward. As their translator, Aaron was fluent in the local dialects, a Texan who had grown up speaking Pashto and Dari at home before qualifying for the teams like everyone else. He wasn't just along for the languages. He could shoot as well as any of them. Right now, he was their only chance of getting information from this dying man before it was too late. Aaron knelt beside the wounded fighter and spoke softly, one hand resting on the man's shoulder. They talked in hushed tones for what felt like a long time, the insurgent occasionally raising a trembling arm to point at the cave entrance. Dave watched the light slowly fading from his eyes. He had seen it before. The man's words grew softer and softer, melting into incoherent murmurs, until finally his head slumped to the side, and he let out one final rattling breath. Joey immediately asked what the man had said, whether Aaron had asked about the plutonium. Aaron stood slowly. He was from Texas, usually wearing a bright smile and a seemingly permanent tan, but at that moment he was as white as the snow around them, blinking rapidly and shaking his head as if trying to clear it. He stared at the cave entrance, that narrow gap in the rock no bigger than a refrigerator door. The darkness inside absolute. Aaron told them what he had learned. The Brotherhood had brought the plutonium here, to this mountain, to build a bomb, originally intended for an American city. But when they set up camp in these caves, they woke something. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time, and suddenly their plans changed. The weapon wasn't going to be used against the infidels anymore. It was going to be used against whatever was hunting them in the darkness. It hadn't worked. The words hung in the air. Thomas let out a short, disbelieving laugh, but there was no humor in it. Aaron continued. The tribal elders in this region had warned everyone to stay away from this place. The warnings went back generations. Stories passed down from a time before religion, before written language, before any of the things that defined modern civilization. These were people whose ancestors had fought against Alexander the Great, whose oral traditions stretched back thousands upon thousands of years, and those traditions said that these mountains were sacred, that there was something living in them that wanted to keep them that way. The Brotherhood had thought they could use a nuclear weapon against it. They had been wrong. The silence that followed seemed to last for hours. Finally, Joey spoke, his voice hard. He acknowledged what Aaron had told them, but pointed out that they still had a mission to complete. There was a significant quantity of weapons-grade plutonium somewhere inside that cave, and they had to secure it. They couldn't abandon the operation based on the dying words of a superstitious fighter. Thomas asked if they were really going to ignore everything they had seen. The bodies, the carnage, whatever had done all of this, and just walk into that cave anyway. He said it with all due respect, but the plan sounded insane. Joey's response was measured, but firm. He acknowledged they couldn't say for certain what had killed all these men. For all they knew, the cell had run into an opposing force or been caught in an ambush. He wasn't willing to stake the entire mission and the possibility of a nuclear attack on local superstitions. They had a job to do, and they were going to do it. He called for volunteers. He needed 4 men to go in with him, while the rest would stay outside and provide security. In the end, there were no more arguments. Dave volunteered, along with Aaron, Andy, and Carlos. He checked his rifle one more time, making certain a round was chambered, then flipped his night vision goggles down and followed Joey into the darkness. His heart pounded like a jackhammer. The sweat on the back of his neck felt like ice water as they moved into the cave, using the infrared illuminators mounted on their rifles in conjunction with the goggles to light their way. The beams were invisible to the naked eye, visible only through the night vision, painting the path ahead in shades of gray and green. The smell hit them almost immediately. Outside, the wind and cold air had helped dampen the stench of death. In here, there was nothing to dilute it. The reek of blood and decay was so thick, Dave nearly gagged, trying to breathe through his mouth, but the cloying odor forced its way into his nose and throat regardless. They moved in single file down the narrow passage, walking at a half crouch to avoid hitting their heads on the low ceiling. It didn't take long to find the first bodies, or what remained of them, mostly scraps of clothing and dark streaks of gore on the walls. Occasionally, they came across part of a torso, or a head, or a scattered collection of limbs. More than once, Dave nearly slipped in something wet and had to catch himself, each time taking in lungfuls of the damp, putrid air. The corridor gradually widened until they were standing in a circular chamber with 2 additional passages branching off to either side. Dave's heart sank at the thought of having to split the team, painfully aware of the horror movie cliché they were walking into. But then Joey tapped his shoulder and pointed his infrared beam at something against the far wall, a wooden crate, half hidden in the shadows. Even through the grainy green image of the night vision, the bright yellow radiation warning symbol painted on the side was impossible to miss. Dave approached cautiously, slinging his rifle and removing his pack. He could hear Joey and Carlos behind him, beginning to place demolition charges on the walls to collapse the cave once they were finished. The hinges on the crate groaned as he slowly lifted the lid, wincing at the sound, and stared at what lay inside. A metallic sphere, roughly the size of a grapefruit, nestled in a bed of protective foam. Plutonium, despite its terrifying applications, was actually safe to handle with bare hands. The radiation it emitted couldn't even penetrate skin. It only became truly dangerous if inhaled or ingested. Or, of course, if someone put it inside a nuclear weapon. But Dave wasn't about to just drop it in his pocket. He fished a finely woven containment bag from his pack, carefully slipped the sphere inside, and secured the whole thing in his bag before standing up and turning around. His feet refused to move. His brain short-circuited, simply refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. He blinked. Once, twice. It was still there. The only word Dave could think of to describe it was thing. Not a man, not a beast, something in between, something that shouldn't exist. It crouched on the far side of the chamber, partially obscured by shadow, but what he could see was enough to make his mind rebel. Matted, filthy fur hung from its hunched shoulders. 4 limbs, impossibly long, bending at angles that made no anatomical sense, supported its massive frame. Had it stood upright on all fours, it would have been at least 10 feet tall, but it sat hunched and compressed, coiled like a spring, claws the length of bayonets extended from each appendage, clicking softly against the stone whenever it shifted its weight. And its face. There was no face, just an empty black void in the vague shape of a skull, or maybe a beak, something that hurt to look at directly. But there was one feature Dave could see with terrible clarity, rows upon rows of teeth, glistening in the darkness, dripping something onto the floor beneath. The thing wasn't breathing. Every time it stopped moving, it became perfectly still. Not even the subtle rise and fall of respiration. Just absolute, unnatural stillness. And then Dave understood something that made his blood run even colder. It wasn't hunting, it was guarding. The chamber, the mountain, whatever sacred thing this place represented, that was what mattered. It had let them walk through the corridors. It had let them find the plutonium, but it wasn't going to let them leave with it. Some distant part of Dave's mind registered that Joey had moved up beside him. One hand held his rifle trained on the creature. The other clutched the detonation switch for the explosives they had already planted throughout the chamber. Joey's eyes flicked toward the corridor behind them, the message clear, the exit. Dave wanted to scream at him. Running seemed insane, but it was the only option they had. He took a single step. His boot landed in something soft, something that had once been part of a person, now just a smear of viscera on the rock. The wet sound it made echoed through the chamber. The creature's reaction was instantaneous. It braced itself against the wall in a series of jerky, snapping movements and opened its mouth. The sound that emerged was unlike anything Dave had ever heard. It was the sound of 1,000 men dying at once, a shriek of pure rage and hatred that reverberated through the small space in wave after wave, burrowing into his skull and rattling his teeth. Dave screamed in response, pure terror flooding his veins. They were all screaming now, but their voices were nothing compared to that roar, specks of sand in a hurricane, drowned into absolute meaninglessness. Dave couldn't say who fired first. He thought it was Joey, but in the chaos it was impossible to tell. Muzzle flashes erupted from every direction, strobing through the chamber like lightning, deafening in the enclosed space. And yet the sound of their rifles seemed muted somehow, swallowed by the darkness. The creature itself seemed to be made of living shadow, cloaked in blackness even when the muzzle flashes illuminated everything else. Only those savage teeth remained visible, gleaming in the chaos. Carlos was shouting something, reaching for Dave's arm, trying to pull him toward the exit. His fingers had just brushed Dave's sleeve when he was snatched away. The creature hadn't seemed to move, but suddenly it was there. One set of claws hoisting Carlos into the air by his throat while the others punched through his abdomen, erupting from his back in a spray of crimson. Carlos made a low keening noise, shaking and squirming, trying to bring his rifle to bear. He never got the chance. The creature pulled in opposite directions and Carlos came apart. Dave's hands moved on their own, flipping his selector switch to fully automatic, bringing up his rifle and squeezing the trigger as the creature lunged forward. One of its appendages swept through the air in a wide arc, and Aaron simply ceased to exist above the shoulders, his body crumpling to the floor as his head bounced away into the darkness. Andy tried to dodge but caught a glancing blow, one of those hooked claws raking across his throat. The impact hurled him into the wall with a wet crunch of shattering bone. Whatever conscious thought Dave had left evaporated. He emptied his magazine, screaming wordlessly, and reached for another one. The creature turned toward him and Joey, teeth clicking together like iron nails on stone. It crouched, preparing to spring. Dave was bracing for the end, the searing agony of claws tearing through his flesh, the sudden weightlessness of his head leaving his shoulders, when something heavy slammed into his chest and knocked him backward off his feet. He skidded across the stone floor, blinking blood and sweat from his eyes. Joey lay crumpled against the wall where the impact had thrown him. His tactical vest had been torn away, revealing 4 ragged holes in his abdomen where his ribs now jutted through. He gasped and sputtered for breath, blood misting the air with every cough. The creature had turned on him, circling, teeth clicking in what might have been anticipation. Joey looked up from the ruin of his torso. His head bobbed weakly, but his eyes found Dave's. They were only a few feet apart. He couldn't speak, his throat was filling with blood, but he managed to lift his left hand. The detonator was still clutched in his fingers. The safety catch had already been flipped off. His lips moved, forming a single word without sound. Go. Dave ran. He wasn't even conscious of making the decision. One moment he was lying on the floor of that nightmare chamber, and the next he was sprinting down the narrow corridor, bouncing off the walls in the darkness, his night vision a blur of gray and green. Behind him, he heard gunfire, Joey emptying his last magazine in one continuous burst. then silence, then thunder. The explosion was everywhere at once, inside his head, inside his chest, pushing and pulling on every fiber of his being. The pressure wave caught him like a giant hand and shoved him forward, lifting him off his feet and hurling him toward daylight. He had a fraction of a second to realize that the blast itself might kill him, but his body was beyond processing that information. All he could feel was Joey's hand on his back, shoving him toward the exit, screaming at him to keep going. The pressure wave spat him out of the cave and into the blinding light of day. He hit the ground hard and rolled, coming to rest in a heap of loose rock and debris. Stones and chunks of the mountainside rained down around him, and all he could do was curl into a ball and wait for it to stop, choking on lungfuls of dust and grit. Everything hurt. His head was screaming. His chest felt like it had been crushed. Pain had become his entire existence, the only thing that told him he was still alive. Time lost all meaning. Adrenaline and shock did strange things to perception, but eventually, slowly, reality began to take shape again. Dave felt like he was clawing his way up from the bottom of a deep pit, fighting toward the surface 1 inch at a time. When he finally felt hands grabbing at him, he lashed out instinctively, kicking and punching and yelling, his fingers scrabbling for the pistol on his belt. He was going to die with an empty weapon and blood on his hands. Thomas slapped him. Hard enough to blur his vision and send his whole body numb for a few seconds. Hard enough to finally pull him back to the present. Dave blinked dust from his eyes and found Thomas's face hovering above him, eyes wide and mouth moving, saying something Dave couldn't hear through the ringing in his ears. Thomas was pointing frantically toward the cave. Dave managed to roll onto his side, expecting to see that thing crawling out of the rubble to finish what it had started. Instead, he saw a pile of broken rock where the entrance had been. Clouds of dust and smoke still rose from between the stones. The cave had collapsed. Whatever was inside, the creature, the bodies, all of it, was buried under tons of mountainside. But even as Dave stared at the rubble, some part of him wondered if that was enough. If something that old, something that patient, something that had been waiting in those mountains since before humanity learned to write, if something like that could really be stopped by explosives and falling stone, or if it was just waiting again, buried in the darkness, listening for the next footsteps to echo through its domain. Dave stared at the rubble for what felt like hours. He couldn't process what he was seeing. He couldn't process anything at all. It was only when Thomas grabbed his shoulder and shook him that he found enough coherence to understand the words being spoken to him. Extraction was on the way. They were getting out. The first sound that filtered through as his hearing returned was the distant thrum of helicopter blades echoing off the peaks. And beneath that, the ever-present moan of wind through the mountains, carrying sounds that might have been voices or might have been nothing at all. The official report on Operation Condor would never be released to the public. It was classified at the highest levels and would probably stay that way for decades. The military eventually put out a press release, sanitized and stripped of anything meaningful. It said that 4 special operations personnel had been killed during a firefight with Taliban forces in a cave system in northeastern Afghanistan. Aaron, Andy, Carlos, and Joey were posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for their valor. The surviving members of the team were sworn to secrecy. Most of them were happy to agree. They wanted to forget. Dave wanted to forget too, but he couldn't. The others knew something terrible had happened in that cave, something beyond explanation, but they didn't know the truth. And Dave didn't want them to. Nobody else needed to carry that weight. He left the military as soon as his contract was up, because the truth was something that couldn't be written in any report or spoken in any briefing room. There were things in those mountains, things that had existed since before humans had words to describe them, since before the first religions tried to explain the unexplainable. Things that the Afghan tribes had feared for thousands of years, that they had warned each other about in stories passed down through countless generations, things that wanted to be left alone. Dave made it out of that cave carrying weapons-grade plutonium on his back, and the knowledge of what he had seen burned into his mind. And every night since, when he closes his eyes, he sees that void where a face should be. He hears those teeth clicking in the darkness. He feels Joey's hand on his back, shoving him forward, and hears that single silent word, "Go." Some mountains are sacred not because the gods live there. They're sacred because something older does. Something hungry. Something that doesn't want to be found. And now Dave knows why the tribes avoid those peaks. Why certain stories are never written down. Why some places in this world are meant to remain untouched. There's something in the mountains of Afghanistan, and it doesn't want us there.